Okay.
Perfect. Okay, and according to my phone, it says 7 o'clock, so we will get started. So hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Janet Hoy, and I am a board member and an active member of the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley. And Sue Brandy, my associate at the League, and I will be your two presenters tonight on Prop 1. And Anne Granland, who is the president of the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley, will be manning the chat and letting people in, etc. This is not an official webinar setup. So we're going to ask people to please mute their microphones so that we can have kind of quiet in the background. Our plan for this evening is absolutely to take questions and have some conversation. Well, we would like to do that after we have completed the presentation itself. So, let's see if we can, I will be advancing the slides. So what are we going to cover today? We wanted to welcome everybody, of course, and we did some introductions. We're going to spend just a small amount of time on a little primer on how to evaluate ballot measures themselves, and that comes from the League of Women Voters, California. Then we're going to get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of Prop 1. We're going to talk about a couple other pieces of legislation that have a real impact on Prop 1 that we think that are important for establishing some context around this. Then we're going to do the traditional pro and con stuff. Who supports Prop 1 and why? And who funds the supporters of Prop 1, the campaign? Who opposes Prop 1 and why? And who finances the opposition? And then, as I said a moment ago, we're sort of going to turn off the educational portion, and we're just going to open it up to everybody to either ask questions or talk about kind of what you think about this. From casual conversations that I've had with people, many people seem to have a relationship with people who have experienced serious mental health in their lives and have some strong feelings about it. So we thought instead of having, could everybody mute themselves? I'm hearing an echo. Thank you. So we thought we'd just give people an opportunity to sort of talk it through a little bit with us as when we're done, once we're done with the presentation. Okay. So what does Prop 1 do, and how do you evaluate propositions in general? We all know that although there is only one proposition on this ballot, which is the primary ballot, and the election day is Tuesday. I'm hearing an echo. Are you hearing an echo?
We really need for this. What? Chris, you need to mute yourself. Thank you.
Great, that's better. So these are some obvious things, but we thought they were worth kind of repeating and reiterating. So what does the measure hope to accomplish? And do you agree with what it's trying to accomplish, first and foremost? Who are the sponsors and opponents? We'll obviously get into that. Does the measure create its own revenue sources, or are new revenues going to have to be generated somehow? Are there things in the proposition that are going to be required but don't have any money to make them happen? And is the measure well written? This measure is, believe it or not, 68 pages in your election ballot book. There is an awful lot of nuance here. And I think it is important for us to keep in mind, is a yes or no really, will a yes or no really answer all the questions that are part of the proposition? So just sort of a few critical things to be thinking about as we go through this. So many of you know about the point in time count. Every 2 years, those communities that receive federal funds, I think they're from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, do what is called a point in time count, which counts community to community across the country, across the state of California, all of the people who are homeless in their community. And then the numbers are all added up and it goes back to the federal government. This point of time count in California was done in January 2023, so a little over a year ago. And at that time, there were 181,000 homeless people throughout the state. 61% were considered short-term homelessness. They were homeless for a short term and then they got into some sustained housing. 39%, almost 40% were chronically homeless, meaning they did not get off the street. They were on the street always. 25% of them were people who were defined as having severe mental illness, and 24% had substance use disorder. Now, there was overlap in these percentages. So many people who have severe mental illness also suffer with substance use disorder. Oakland and LA had higher homeless rates than San Francisco, and the rate is done per 100,000 people. 1 in 5 of the unhoused in this state want treatment, but can't access it. So I think we all know we have a problem with homelessness community to community across the state. And these are some of the numbers from the latest review that was done. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Sue.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We're going to talk about Proposition 1. And Proposition 1 asks the question, should a greater share of MHSA, which is Mental Health Service Act funding, be used and new funds issued to build treatment facilities and housing for people with mental illness and substance use disorders, as well as housing for other homeless individuals? This is a really, really simplified version of what this proposition suggests. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit more information so that you understand a little better. This is overly simplified.
Okay, can I just jump in? I'm sorry, Sue, there was something I forgot to say. And that is, as Sue says, this is really the 10,000 foot level of Prop 1. There are other organizations that are doing a kind of a county view. I know Patricia, who's maybe in and out of this call, and actually Contra Costa County is doing a review like this as a webinar of Prop 1. This Prop 1 will be different across every county in our state. Our effort is to look at it from a little bit higher level and not get into all of the weeds around the county-specific implications.
Thank you. So can we go to the next slide? Okay. Before we start, it's important we understand what the Mental Health Services Act is right now. We need to go, yeah, there we go. Thank you. Because what this proposition does is it amends this act. So right now, Mental Health Services Act is functioning. And since 2004, it was Proposition 63, called the Millionaire's Tax. 1% was a surtax on the incomes of people who earned in excess of $1 million. That's how it is right now. The dollars that were collected were dedicated to funding mental health services. And this accounts for about a third of the county's behavioral health resources in most counties in the state. So we're looking at, when we move into talking about Prop 1, we're talking about a third of the income that goes to the counties. The Mental Health Services Act focuses on prevention, early intervention, community-based care, and what is called whatever it takes approach. So as people are encountered, it's like, what do you need? And how do we make this happen? And it's a little more singular than what we're talking about when we get on to Prop 1. Okay, next slide. So Prop 1, first of all, changes the name of the Mental Health Act to the Behavioral Health Service Act. And it will authorize $6.3 billion statewide for a bond to create mental health and substance abuse treatment beds and housing services. That's one big part of it. That will create 4,350 housing units, and it'll create 6,800 mental health and substance abuse treatment slots or beds. This is for inpatient treatment, the 4,350 and the 6,800. So there's a total of 11,150 new housing units statewide. And then there will be an additional 26,700 outpatient treatment slots as a result of this proposition. The money that is going to be used will be focused on individuals at risk for homelessness and veterans with severe mental illness and or substance abuse. And this is really important. It's going to really try to focus on the most severe situations for both mental health and substance abuse. It's not across the board available to anybody. Okay. Prop 1 amends the Mental Health Service Act for sure. And it does that by modifying how MHSA funds are allocated to the counties. There is going to be a change in the oversight if it passes, changes in accountability, and changes in the community planning process. The counties will still receive the bulk of the money from the millionaire's tax. The changes and the allocation to focus will be on severe behavioral health, homelessness, and there is a particular amount of money set aside for veterans. So they're taking this same amount of money separate from the bonds. They're taking a block of money, $140 million, and they are going to reallocate, going to put that towards housing. And towards the state for monitoring all of this. So that's what the counties will lose. They will lose about $140 million through statewide. It's not per county, which means they need to change how they do their services. There will be no new taxes. It's bonds. It will result in $310 per month per year, $310 million per year, sorry, in debt service and $9.3 billion in total. So that's how the Mental Health Service Act gets changed. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Recent legislation. The reason we're talking about recent legislation is because these two bills, which were 2022 and 2023, really can't be enacted in full without the Proposition 1 passing. One of them is Community Care Recovery and Empowerment Act. This creates the Care Court, if anybody is familiar with that is. And it is an attempt to intervene upstream in the process. It's not early intervention. It's not when people are, first starting to have problems. They're in trouble. They're often have been arrested. They're into the criminal justice system, but although not always. This court allows for a broader array of people to petition the civil court. Families can petition, mental health practitioners can petition to create voluntary or court-ordered treatment plans. And the treatment plans are going to be anywhere up to 24 months of a plan with a team of people who will help manage that plan for that person. And they can vary as to how they're set up. This is just being rolled out from 2022, but it's happening in stages throughout the state. Also, the California 5150 law is being revived. For those of you who don't know what 5150 used to be, I was a practicing mental health practitioner. A 5150 meant you could hospitalize somebody if they were a risk to themselves or others. What they're trying to do is, what they have done is change the reform so that the conservatorship system is changing, and it expands the definition of gravely disabled so that it will now include those who are unable to provide basic needs for themselves, not just are on the verge of killing themselves. Okay. The pro position. The people who want this position to pass are saying that Proposition 1 addresses California's urgent crisis of homelessness, mental health, and addiction. It authorizes $6.4 million in bonds and directs billions of dollars more annually to expand mental health and addiction services, build permanent supportive housing, and help homeless veterans. So that's the statement from the pro side. And I just want to add something that, is not always put in these, but is definitely a primary part of this proposition. It is for severely mentally ill and people who are severely affected by substance abuse. Okay. Supporters say that this will build 4,350 housing units and 6,800 treatments. That was what we heard right at the beginning. It supports homeless veterans with, and I'm going to add this, with severe mental health needs and substance abuse needs. And that is just a portion of it. It also will help other Californians. It's not just for veterans. It provides treatment over incarceration, and it reprioritizes existing funds, typo, and generates new funds without increasing taxation. So the supporters are, number one, the Indians. Actually, there's a lot more support. There was 14.2 million, I'm sorry. The Indians of Grayton Rancheria. And the reason why the reservation, the Native American people would like this to pass is they also will receive a chunk of money that's specifically written into the proposition to provide beds for mentally ill on their reservations. So it is not, that's a separate chunk that hasn't been as well publicized as the veterans. Healthcare organizations, Sutter Health, California Hospital Association, and Kaiser, correctional officers, state building and construction trades, because of course they'll get to build, and the SEIU. Interestingly enough, you have a split between mental health providers. Some say, God, we've got to do this. And others say, oh no, it's going to take away from the treatment we're getting now. And NAMI, which is a association for families of people with mental illness, support this proposition.
Can I ask, could I ask people if they could mute again? Because I'm hearing lots of breaking up and kind of interference. I don't know about other people.
Thank you. The media, many of the media have endorsed this. San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times, San Diego Union Tribune, the Sacramento Bee. It's been really interesting to me what the opinion pages of the newspapers have been very clear that there are flaws in this proposition, that there's no guarantees, that it takes away from some of the programs that are now in existence. However, they also say that it has to happen. So I just want to read you the end of or a couple of pieces from the San Francisco Chronicle editorial. Opponents of the measure rightly point out the potential negative consequences of spending less Mental Health Services Act money on vital prevention programs, outpatient services, crisis response, and outreach to dedicate more funds to housing. Nevertheless, there's reason to believe that with new data reporting and accountability requirements, new laws on the books, and strong pressure to deliver measurable results from the governor's office, proposition will be different. The status quo is not an option, and that means voting yes on Proposition 1 on March 5th. So that's the kind of complication it is. It's really a weighing of priorities, and that makes it very complicated. So hopefully we'll be able to help clear some of that up. Janet?
Okay, the con position. People who are not in favor of this think it is huge, expensive, and destructive. It costs more than $10 billion, but really isn't a solution to homelessness. The con people really focus on the fact that there's going to be a relatively small percentage of the homeless that will be impacted by this in terms of getting them into some sort of housing. They think it's a bad time for new bonds and debt. And the big thing is, they say Prop 1 cuts funds for mental health programs that are working. And Sue did talk about that. The counties will get less money. Mental health advocates and taxpayer groups oppose it. So opponents also say the measure was rushed through the legislature without substantial debate, particularly for those community groups that serve marginalized communities in each county. It diminishes dollars and services the counties currently provide and it restricts some local control because, as Sue pointed out, the state share goes from 5% to 10% for their oversight responsibilities, and the counties will be receiving less money, which means presumably they will have to cut back on some programs. Opponents say it will increase involuntary treatment. The changes will sideline current clients. The counties will redirect $1 billion a year from community services to housing. So in total, amongst all the counties. And again, there's concern about impact of increase in involuntary treatments. So a lot of concerns about what this would do if it were enacted. So here are the Prop 1 opponents. Top of the list is League of Women Voters California. The Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, because of the, presumably, although there are no new taxes, there will be debt from the bond, and that will have to come from somewhere. Paying the interest and paying back the bond will have to come from somewhere, and it will come from the general accounts. Mental Health America of California opposes it, Cal Voices, and Disability Rights. Now, if you remember, I think it was 14 million on the slide that was the people in favor of it. Total donations, from what I could find, for the opponents is $1,000. And there's only one group that I could find that has said no on Prop 1 within the media, and that is the Southern California News Group, which presumably I think is a group of smaller community papers throughout Southern California. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing here. And I think what we would like to do is just invite anyone who would like to, and I should officially say we're ending the educational part of this, although we'll certainly take questions. Let us know first and foremost if you think this was enough information, if it was the kind of information you're looking for in order to make a decision. I assume most of you have received your ballots already and are getting ready to fill them out, or maybe you already have. So just let us know, if you would, what you think about the proposition or about the presentation.
Carol?
I just listened to the webinar this afternoon about Measure X, where they're just getting so many things kind of underway and started, including the care courts and all that sort of thing. And I can't help but think about our individual county. I just wish I knew how it's going to affect the suburbs. You know, so often it seems to me things go to the urban areas where there's such need. So I'm still confused.
Well, Carol, I can tell you that Contra Costa County is doing a Prop 1 webinar a week from today. It's the 22nd at 2 p.m. And I'm happy to send out to this group the way to link into that webinar. And that will indeed give you the impact on our county specifically. We couldn't really do that in this presentation. And again, it'll be different counties across the state, but there will be the opportunity to see the impacts here at home.
May I ask something else?
Sure.
Infrastructure, that means actually building and getting permits and doing that kind of thing, which counties really can't afford unless you gather the money together, right? I mean, is that part of it?
That's coming from the state. That part of it, the bonds structure, infrastructure part I believe is that the state will be doing organizing that building part of it. The counties will have to figure out how they're going to support that, how they're going to use it. Things is that your understanding too, Janet?
Yes, the bonds are being floated by the state, and the bond revenue is what will be used for the capital development of facility beds up and down the state.
Susan Requa has a question.
Yeah, two of them. One of them is about the organization that's supporting it. I think it was NAMI. And I'm wondering if that's the same group that has done so much work in our own county after the shooting in Walnut Creek. And, you know, if they've provided any content about why they do support it. And the second part of it is, what about the locations? As I see it, bond money is the only way we are going to get any other structural support in terms of buildings and clinics and such for mental health purposes. And so I'm really torn because I don't see any other way to get those facilities. And I understand there's a shortage of them. So that was the two things I wanted to ask you all about.
NAMI is the organization that has worked so hard in Contra Costa County. That is true. And if I don't know specifically what they've said. Someplace in my files, I have a short excerpt from them, but I believe they feel like the having more housing will support the seriously mentally ill, like the young man who was killed in Walnut Creek, and bring them out of the community enough to, when they get, in this case, he had stopped taking medication, to be able to be treated in a safe environment until he was able to get back on his medication and things. So I think it is because they feel like the resources that come from this new proposition would help the seriously mentally ill and their families.
Yeah, and I just looked it up, and this is from the website, and I can just read it. It's pretty short. NAMI California is proud to support Prop 1 and the meaningful investment in our state's behavioral health system to modernize the Mental Health Services Act and prioritize funding for individuals living with serious mental health. Our voice was instrumental in getting the MHSA passed in 2004. That was the millionaire's tax we talked about. And there is a reason that the MHSA's heart is client and family driven. We were pleased to have a seat at the table. While the MHSA has positively transformed the public mental health system, addressing the critical needs of those living with serious mental illness has gradually diminished along the way. So they are a big supporter of this. And we're apparently at the table with the governor.
Joanne?
My understanding is that NAMI did not offer their support of this bill until a certain definition was changed, and that was the definition of now I don't remember the phrase, gravely ill or gravely disturbed.
Gravely, I have it somewhere.
Or severely mentally ill?
No, it was another terminology.
Yeah, but that definition was critical for their support as well. And because
I think it was gravely disabled, but I'm not sure.
That may be it, yes. And they also, I don't remember their stance on the care courts, but that's also been very controversial. And this is a big issue in some ways. It also it seems like people's experience with mental illness, whether personally or through family members, will play a part in deciding this as their vote, as well as people who don't have any experience with mental illness, either personally or with families and friends, being influenced by the homelessness they see. So there's some really strong thoughts on this, and it's a very complex situation. And I have a question for you, which is, if this doesn't pass, what happens?
Nothing. The MHSA continues as it is.
And it does not encompass substance abuse? It won't, substance abuse funding will be separate? Okay, just curious.
There,
Patricia, can you comment on that? Is that correct in your understanding if this does not pass, that substance abuse would not be covered as it would if this does pass?
So my understanding of the MHSA at this time is that it will cover substance use treatment if the person is dual diagnosed. If they also are diagnosed with a severe mental illness, there is a very large overlap between those two populations, between people with substance use disorder and people with severe mental illness. And so people who have both would get coverage for both under MHSA funding, but people who have only substance use disorders would have to continue to get their treatment through the alternative funding mechanisms for substance use treatment, which are often largely county funded programs. There is no really good big dedicated stream of money that pays for substance use disorder treatment like the MHSA. There's nothing comparable to that for substance use disorder.
there's a comment from Jean Perry that Contra Costa NAMI affiliate does not support Prop 1.
Oh,
I've gotten mixed. We've got other messages from someone else differently than that, so I don't know what is accurate.
My understanding is that the position on Prop 1 is taken at the state level and that affiliates are asked not to take a position.
I see. Thank you.
Sacramento County considers itself to not have taken a position. So I'm sorry I missed most of your presentation.
I'm glad that you were here to help us with some of the answers.
I'm happy to answer anything I can.
I just want to emphasize again, this is an incredibly complicated proposition. And as I've talked to people in this last week, what I've realized is it's going to come down to, I think Joanne was sort of suggesting this, it's going to come down with what is your priorities? Are your priorities about housing? Or are they about kind of, street level treatment? And both of them are important. And so what do we do? I think it makes it very complicated. We will not, Prop 1 passing will not mean that all of the other treatment programs will go away. It just means there will have to be new decisions within the county as to how the money is spent.
Can I sort of say a little bit about what you've just said?
Sure.
So Proposition 1, the bond measure, the bulk of the bond measure will go towards treatment beds, will not go towards housing. I think it's not correct to put those two things together.
They do put it together when they describe it, but thank you.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do. But only $1.1 billion goes towards the veteran services, which is about 2,000 beds for veterans, or 20% of the veterans in the state, and about $900 million towards residential beds for people with substance use disorder or severe mental illness or both. The bulk of the money will go towards creating some kind of facilities or very complex residential programs that provide both clinical and custodial services to people with severe illness who are too sick to be able to manage to live in the community, even in permanent supported housing. So the bulk of the money, 2/3 of the money, is going to go for that. And there is a desperate need throughout the state for beds that are treatment beds, that are step-down beds that allow people to go from an acute level of care to a subacute or residential level of care. Some communities don't even have any acute beds. Some communities like ours have acute beds, but no subacute beds. Subacute beds are beds that are usually locked and usually for people who are still gravely disabled, even though they've had treatment and stabilized in an acute hospital setting. So there's a need for those beds. So that's the bond measure side of it. The MHSA measure side of it attempts to change the way that counties use their money to force them to focus on using.
So late, I'm just going to listen to it. And you can listen to it
Diane,
too.
will you mute yourself, please?
The MHSA funding requires that counties shift money from providing outpatient and crisis services to using that money to pay for housing subsidies and rents and leasing, to put people into housing who are not currently in housing for a variety of reasons. And different counties are more and less effective with their ability to get people housed who are living in encampments, which half of the money would be required to go to people who are chronically homeless, which means they must have been homeless for a year or 4 times in the last 3 years, unless they've been in an institution like a hospital or a jail for more than 90 days, in which case they are no longer considered chronically homeless and no longer qualify for those funds. So it ties the county's hands in ways that may make it difficult to achieve the objectives that are being sought. And it definitely requires, I haven't heard of a single county where there wasn't going to be a significant shift of funding away from outpatient and crisis services into supporting, paying for housing, paying landlords to rent to them, because mostly what happens is they have to pay subsidies to landlords to get them to rent housing to people who have been chronically homeless, because landlords don't want to rent to them. And so the behavioral health services ends up having to spend much more money to rent that apartment for that person than you might have to pay to rent that apartment if you walked in off the street. So money will go for that. It's 25% limited in how much can be spent to actually build new housing. Our Sacramento County, we already spend more than we're going to be allowed to spend on building housing. This is not true in all counties. Some counties haven't spent any money on building housing. Some are spending more than we're spending on building housing. It's one of the problems with taking the approach that this legislation does, which is to move much of the decision-making from the county level to the state level. So the decision-making is being made at the state level, that these are what our priorities are going to be. These are how we're going to tell counties to execute those priorities, and taking away from counties much of the flexibility that they've had to address their local needs with innovative and tailored programming.
Thank you, Patricia. That was really helpful. And you're from San Mateo County, you said?
Sacramento.
Sacramento. Okay, thank you. Carol.
Is there any sunset to this law? I mean, can you undo it or anything like that if it isn't working?
Just like Proposition 63, which was passed 20 years ago, for this to be changed, it has to go through another proposition.
I just want to make a quick comment. I think one of the objections the league stipulates about Prop 1, and this is true for many of the propositions. Sue and I have been doing the pros and cons from propositions for the last few cycles, is that this is really complicated. And to have it go to the voters to make a yes or no decision on it sort of does it a bit of a disservice, because, and many people believe that this is sort of the legislature's job, is to do this stuff, right? And that it really shouldn't come to the people for these kinds of decisions that are complex, complicated, and require a fair amount of inquiry to really sort of figure out what it's all about and to know kind of how to vote on it. So again, we just put together kind of a high level thing. Again, I thank Patricia too for a little more detail on this, but this is a really complex thing, and it's different in every county how it's going to be impacted. And I think that just makes it a really hard thing for us to decide with a simple yes and no. And that's one of the objections from the league.
Jean?
So I am from San Mateo County, and I have seen our figures against Sacramento counties, and it's true. It impacts differently, but the heart of MHSA has been community planning input. And so you determine what services are going to be supporting who by what is needed in your county. And to make that the same across 58 counties is ridiculous. And so really important life-changing supports that have been in place since MHSA passed are things like full service partnerships, which helps people who are emerging from the acute setting to continue their recovery path so that they have choice, they have options, they have the kind of peer support they need to find recovery. And yes, maybe on paper, this new version is going to have the same number of dollars to pay for therapists and meds, but that isn't what leads people to recovery, either with substance abuse or with mental health issues. And I think if you look at the Cal Voices website, you'll find some information about why they so strongly oppose this. And there is evidence that shows that involuntary treatment is not the key. And yes, it's necessary in some circumstances, as we've had the laws in the past that have now been modified to be able to involuntarily hold people on a broader range, but the evidence says that involuntary treatment is not the solution. And this is so weighted towards building facilities for involuntary treatment. And people, of course, all the advertising is promoting the housing for veterans and all. And it is true, $1 billion of the bond will go for supported housing, which has been very successful. And I can't think of another group in our society that we need to support. They've given so much to us. And there is all the rest of the people who have those same acute needs, that this is not going to cover their needs. And it's going to take services away, like crisis support, which prevents hospitalizations, which prevents acute care, and outpatient services and peer support, the things that help people get things turned around. If they have the right kind of support, they're much more likely to find recovery. So I am wringing my hands that that this doesn't pass. I'm pretty distressed about it, and I'm pretty distressed that our lawmakers agreed to sign on to this before it was even written. It was, especially the last part of it, was written in the dead of night where no one could, they didn't even have hearings. And that just makes my stomach turn, because that shouldn't be our legislative process. We should be able to see, it should be transparent. I mean, is that a league value or what?
Yeah.
And they intentionally did this in the dead of night, are rushing it through so that this isn't a ballot measure on the November ballot. They had to make sure it came through before anyone had really realized what was in it. So I'm obviously on the con side of this.
Thank you, Jane.
Can I just say that, one of the problems like Sacramento County has is we lack step-down beds. And so one of the results of that is, the unintended consequence of that is that people who are placed in an acute setting and are stabilized, but really need something step down from that, there's nowhere for them to go. And so they are often released back to the street and end up in the jail. 40% of our jail population has severe mental illness. It is the bed that always says yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's also why the hospitals are supporting this, is because the first place that a homeless person is brought is to the hospital emergency room, and they're referred to as frequent flyers. They rotate through as needed. And it's difficult for the emergency rooms in hospitals as well.
So one of the changes that this legislation makes, and I don't want to place myself in either a pro or cons place. I just want to offer you information. So one of the changes it makes is the current MHSA does not allow any money to be spent for a purpose that would be a law enforcement purpose. So this means that full service partnerships that provide services to people who are justice involved are probably not able to be funded with MHSA dollars. Full service partnerships provide wraparound comprehensive services intended to provide support to people who otherwise would be institutionalized to allow them to stay living in the community. It includes things like 24-hour crisis intervention on spot in-person crisis intervention services, supported housing, benefits management, psychiatric care. It's basically having a parent, the perfect parent. Although full service partnerships are far from perfect, but that's the ideal. That's the ideal, right? The goal. And under the new legislation, there would be that provision would be done away with, and there would be an ability to provide use BHSA money to provide services in full service partnerships or other programs to people who are forensically involved in a way that might mean that they go back to jail as a consequence of their not continuing in treatment. That particular group of people cannot now be served with MHSA money.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? Concerns? If anybody has any feedback for us afterwards, please feel free to let us. Yeah, Anne?
Okay, I've got my mic on. This is such Janet was so right. It's such a mishmash of so much stuff. It's impossible really to pull it apart. And it seems to me the original thought is about visual homelessness. That's what upsets people so much, is to see people on the streets who don't have a place to live. So that's number one. You don't want people on the street. And I also understand that our own Contra Costa County, and I always like to look at these things as how is it going to affect our local environment, because that's what I'm interested in. Our county, mental illness isn't what drives the homelessness and drugs. It's the economy. It's people who are on their last dollar and can't afford to pay the rent, and they get kicked out. So that is the huge driver in Contra Costa. Of course, there's mental illness, and of course there is substance abuse. Those are here, but it's economics which drives our homeless population. So this doesn't meet any of the needs, or it doesn't meet what our issues are. And I always worry about taking local control away, giving it to the state to decide how we spend our local money, because there is only one pot of money. It isn't, if it can't be used for certain things, then those programs go away. There is no alternate funding. So we lose what our local people think is the best thing for us by doing something the state thinks is the best for them. And obviously the drivers are Los Angeles, Oakland, and Sacramento, the bigger communities, not Contra Costa. So it just seems to be the wrong solution for our problems. That's all I got.
Thank you.
And I also already voted, so this is kind of late.
All right.
All right. They did not manage the fourth quarter well last night.
Pat, I think Pat, you need to mute, please. Well, if there is nothing else, comments or questions,
thank you. I may be more confused, but thank you for doing it.
I think we all are. I think it is an incredibly confusing and difficult decision to make. And I change my mind daily, personally.
I have too, but thank you for attending. We really appreciate it. And we invite you to attend. We'll have, obviously there'll be more pros and cons coming up with the general election, and we might do this kind of forum again. I think it's really helpful to hear from other people and get other thoughts about particularly these really complex issues. So thank you all. Appreciate your participation and happy voting.
Thank you all.
Great job, Janet and Sue.
Thank you, ladies.
Sue and Ann, why don't you guys hang out for a minute if you can?
Sure, and I'm going to stop the recording unless you want to continue.
Sounds great.